Right, okay. So now this is for year 12, and this is going to be a set of videos to help you with revision for paper 1. Now I thought the best way to do this was by going through the last 3 years' papers. Now this is a much more extended video. It will be more difficult because I won't be able to go through loads of questions in one video. I'm going to aim at 2 questions per video. This is for something for you to develop as well as just looking at this PowerPoint. But one thing I will be showing you is showing you key examples of the questions. I'm going to show you A grade responses. I'll be giving you content, then I'll be going through certain aspects of an A grade answer, and in one case an A star answer. And it should show you that the level of detail in some places isn't as much as I'm always expecting. So, just a reminder, my paper is split into 3 sections: Section A, Section B, Section C. Section A is 2 essay questions that looks at the understanding of our time period in breadth and target content specified in the themes for the relevant option. Now, the key thing here that you must understand is that some of the questions might cross the themes. So the 4 themes in our paper, we look at parliamentary democracy in the first unit, then we look at working conditions, then we look at unionism, and then we look at poverty. A question might cover the themes, so you could talk about different themes in the questions. Section A will usually cover a period of at least 10 years, and any of the AO1 concepts might be targeted. So it might be a question on causation, like what caused something; consequence, it might be a question on change and continuity; similarity, difference; or it might be a significance question. So how significant was this to the lives of the poor? Section B, again, is 2 essay questions that assess understanding of the period in breadth. Very similar. Questions might cross the theme. The difference with Section B is that questions might cover periods equivalent to 1/3 of the time span of the themes. So the dates that you get in Section B are going to be a lot broader and longer. And then Section C, as I've mentioned before, is the historical interpretation question on why the slave trade was abolished. Again, that is a definite question, and it's something that will be very easy as you develop your knowledge on why the slave trade was abolished. So those 3 questions are very clear. And what we're going to do today is look at Section A of 2017. Now, this is just a reminder of the mark scheme. Now, remember, when you get to the exam, the examiners will use these mark schemes. And roughly, if you get in a level 5 essay, you're looking at A star to A. If you're getting a level 4, you're looking at a B grade. If you're looking at level 3, you're looking at C, D grade. If you're looking at level 2, you're looking at an E grade, and then ungraded if you are hitting level 1 criteria. This is something we'll go through in a bit more detail. I'm not going to go through it in this video because the more important thing with this video is going through content and contextual understanding for the questions. Likewise, this is Section C interpretation mark scheme. It's something you can have a look through if you pause. You can try and get your head around it, but to be honest, these mark schemes I think are meant for the examiners. They're very difficult for students to get their heads round. But there are some key things that we do need to understand with the essays that I'm going to go through today. And one thing in particular is being reliant on a structure. So these are the 2 questions that we're going to go through in this video. Firstly, how accurate is it to say that the continued lack of parliamentary reform in the year 1785 to 1820 is best explained by government fear of revolution? It's a Section A question, but this gives you quite a nice time period. And how accurate is it to say that in the years 1838 to 48, the Chartists failed to achieve their charter because its demands were too ambitious? They're the 2 questions that we're going to be focusing on. The first one is, how accurate is it to say that the continued lack of parliamentary reform in the years 1785 to 1820 is best explained by government fear of revolution? The wording of this question makes it seem a lot more difficult than it actually is. But what this is asking you, basically, the government did not reform the country, not reform the voting system or anything in regards to the parliamentary system because they were scared of revolution. So what we need to work out in this question is, why did the government not go ahead with reform? We know that the first attempt at reform was in 1832 with the Great Reform Act. We need to have this understanding of why did the government not go ahead with reform in the years 1785 to 1820. And the focus of the question is the fear of revolution. So a bit of contextual understanding is how threatening was revolution in England. Now, 1785 to 1795, there were concerns and demands. These concerns and demands were driven by what happened in France with the revolution. 1795 to 1815, there was less threat of revolution to the government because of the Napoleonic Wars, because we were at war with France. And in 1815 to 1820, after the Napoleonic Wars had finished, there was a much bigger demand for reform, and that's where you had some of the more significant events, such as Peterloo. So that's a good overview of looking at the dates in question. Now, in regards to factors, there were 4 that I think you could work on. Now, what you need to understand in an A-level essay is, to be honest, if you are dragged into a stringent structure, it could actually drag you down. What we do know is that every A-level essay must have an introduction. Introduce the question and the factors you will discuss with a mini judgment. That's the first thing that we should definitely be considering. Then, I think personally, the first thing, you've got to have a good factor 1. Talk about what is the focus of the question, and then you should aim to have 3 other factors, 3 other mini paragraphs to discuss. Okay? Then, obviously, you should be finishing with your Gion style conclusion. Now, the one thing that we need to get better at, and essay skills, is making judgments throughout an essay. We need to have an understanding on how important each factor is. And you need to tell the examiner, because what you're doing there is you are building an answer based on criteria. So you are building well, I think this is more important. This is more important. If we looked at why World War I began in this country, or why World War I began full stop, each factor in the eyes of historians has different weightings. So it's up to you. There is no right or wrong answer about what you think is the most important reason why reform happened. But you do need to show the examiner that you get it. You do need to show the examiner that you are developing this argument throughout, and you're not just showing arguments at the end of the essay and at the beginning of the essay. Because what happens then is that it becomes a narrative, and that's really not what A-level needs. You need constant judgment throughout and constant rewording of the question. So in the respect of this question, you need to explain why it would have caused a lack of parliamentary reform. Okay, so I'm going to go through now. This is an example of an outstanding introduction. Now, this tells you what the candidate is going to write about. So, there is no doubt that in the years 1785 to 1820, there was a considerable lack of parliamentary reform. They introduced the question. Whether this lack of reform was down to the government fear of rebellion is questionable. Straight away, they are starting to bring a judgment into their introduction, but does hold some weight, considering what was happening in France. They've given a nice little judgment here about what they think about the question. And they said, yeah, it's partly because of it, but it's questionable whether it was the main reason. However, this is not the only reason for lack of reform, as it could be said that the government in itself was not liberal at this time, and all it wanted was to maintain the status quo. Thirdly, it could be argued that there was no reform due to lack of protest for it, especially during the Napoleonic Wars. And finally, equally worth considering, that's nice, that's a little judgment, is the idea that those who wanted reform did not actually earn it and were not respectable enough to be the subject of parliamentary reform. The only thing missing from this introduction is a mini conclusion. So overall, at this stage, it is clear. and just tell the examiner just what you think at this stage. But why is this such a good introduction? Well, number one, I know the question. This person tells me the question, so I don't need it in front of me. Number two, another good thing this does is it discusses a range of factors that the candidate will use in this answer. And three, this introduction shows that the candidate knows this topic. Yeah, that's important. A confident introduction shows that the essay is going to be quite impressive. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of the factors. Okay? And as I do that, I've given you the pages in the textbook that you can develop this with, but hopefully this will help you understand the concept of each factor. So the first factor that needs considering in this question as to why there was not parliamentary reform is that the government was fearful of revolution. This is what the question asks. If you just talk about this side of the question, then you probably get level 2, maybe level 3. I would argue more level 2. It can't really be a one-sided argument. Okay, so let me just go back. Now this is the content to consider. Now to be honest, when I show you the essay for this, you're going to realise that this is a lot of detail. So first of all, the French Revolution began in 1789, which saw the aristocratic rule overthrown by the population. So in France in 1789, there was this overthrowing of the aristocratic royal family, which led to the people taking control. Now, because of this, there began to be some criticism about the British model. Now, just as we have an understanding, I'll add this to this slide. The British model of parliamentary voting was something which was carried on from the Middle Ages. We know that it was very outdated. You had things like the rotten boroughs, you had pocket boroughs, and it was ruled by the elite society. So there was, and around, in 1785, around 11% of the population could vote. Because the French Revolution occurred, this began to throw up questions about the British model of parliament. People began to question this rich of the rule. Was this something that was correct? So you could argue that because the French Revolution occurred in 1789 to around 1793, that this rule of the rich was starting to be questioned. The government in England was very conservative and they stood up for their rights to be in Parliament. Therefore, there was little reform. So this concept of revolution in France got people thinking whether the model in Britain was correct or not. This led to little reform because the government were very conservative, but you could argue that, the fact that the government stood up for themselves, sort of dug their heels and said it was their right to be in Parliament, does suggest that revolution was the reason for little reform. The second bullet point talks about Thomas Paine's right of man. Now, Thomas Paine's right of man was a way to try and cause more aggravation and revolution with the people, because his book, Right of Man, badmouthed the government. It condemned the government and the inequality of the system. It basically spoke about how bad the system was. It sold 200,000 copies by 1793. And what Rights of Man did was it called for the rule by the people, which in turn would lead to radical reform. Now, the government were concerned that accepting change might lead to something similar to what happened in France, that by giving the people the power, that they would overthrow them eventually. And they were worried that works such as Paine would lead to a revolution, so the government became harsher in limiting people's rights. So, for example, in 1799 and 1800, you had the Combination Act, which banned trade unions. This gave the government more power, but the reason the government were looking for that power was because of people like Thomas Paine, who were making revolutionary texts that might cause people to turn against the government. This shows that the government was scared of revolution, and instead of going ahead with reform, they put new policies in place, which meant that the government could control the people better. The third aspect that we need to understand is that the government had to also deal with revolutionary societies that were set up, which suggests that the government was scared of revolution. The couple that were mentioned in this time period, you could have the Sheffield Society for Constitutional Information, set up in 1791, and the London Corresponding Society, the LCS. And what they did was, they wrote pamphlets to demand reform. The Sheffield Society presented a petition with 10,000 signatures, and in 1795, the LCS had a demonstration which attracted 100,000 people. The government were fearful of revolution, but they weren't going to give in to these groups, so reform was limited. So you could argue that because societies were set up to create this fear of revolution, it actually made the government more committed and dedicated to not pass reform, because they weren't going to give in to the demands of the people. Fear of revolution was shown when the government passed strict laws such as the Treason Act. You can tell here that the government was scared of revolution because they made their actions against the population stricter. So the Treason Act of 1795 made seditious materials, a material that badmouthed government, punishable by death. This suggests that actually the government were scared of revolution, so they weren't going to give people reform. They believed that if they were going to, if they gave reform, that this revolution could occur at a dramatic pace and it could question the government's standing in society. Then you've got the after the war. So this is covering the whole time period. So straight away with this paragraph, we've covered 1785 to 1820. After the war with France in 1815 ended, the fear of revolution again was shown because of events such as the Sparfield riots that happened in 1816 and the Peterloo demonstration in 1819. All of these were demanding reform. Now, the government didn't want to give people reform because they were fearful that giving power to the people would lead to more issues. People couldn't be trusted due to their violent actions. Now, if I'm going to put my opinion across, I think personally, government fear of revolution probably wasn't the main reason for reform. It's a valid reason, but it's definitely not the main one, because you've got a few points here that cross over into the other factors. And if I'm going to show you an example essay. So this is the first paragraph that you could write. I'll zoom in just a little bit. Right. Firstly, it could certainly be said that the lack of parliamentary reform was due to the fear of revolution. They've started with the point. Really strong, clear point. Okay. The most obvious way which this could be seen was the French Revolution in 1793. This in turn brought about criticism of the British model that only benefited the elite. These ideas were found in Thomas Paine's Right of Man, which had sold 250,000 copies by 1793. No doubt the British government would have seen what was happening in France and feared something similar in Britain. This fear could be seen through the policies they introduced to defend themselves, for example, Combination Act, which banned trade unions. This showed that the government had a fear of revolution and they would try to stop it. Indeed, the role of major individuals like Major John Cartwright made the government fear revolution in Britain as ideas of reform became more widespread across the country. Moreover, the creation of societies like the London Society for Constitutional Changes also made the government fear some sort of revolution from below, and after the hiatus during the war with France, people did begin to mobilise as the situation worsened, like Sparfield and St. Petersfield riots. Thus, it could certainly be argued that the reason for lack of parliamentary reform during the years was due to fear of revolution, but it was not the absolute main reason. Now, this isn't one that I've written. This is one that was taken from the exam board website on the examiner report. Is there a lot of detail there? Yeah, it shows that the person knows their stuff. Is it as detailed as we would do? Yes and no. Okay, there is definitely some places where it can be developed. You could talk more about why banning trade unions would prevent reform. You could definitely talk more about the actions of the LCS and also introduce the Sheffield Society. And you can also tell a little bit more about Sparfield's riot and St. Petersfield riots, about how they threatened the government. But this is an acceptable paragraph for the first factor. Factor 2 is that lack of protest during the Napoleonic Wars and patriotism actually were a reason why there wasn't any change. Now, as we go back to the first slide here, remember, during the years 1795 to 1815, Britain were at war with France. When you're at war with another country, people begin to feel patriotic, and they believe that going against the government in this time is actually a bigger sort of insult than anything else. So during times of crisis within a country, they don't turn on the government as much. So there were many societies and individuals who were demanding reform to Parliament. So you had William Cobbett and his Political Register, which was their very cheap newspaper. You also had Thomas Wooler's Black Dwarf, and you also had Henry Hunt, the very popular orator, who was the driving force behind the Peterloo demonstration. But in the year 1795 to 1815, reform was decreasing. This was because war with France. Because we were at war with France, protest became non-existent, because it was seen as unpatriotic to go against your government in a time of crisis. So you could argue that the government didn't introduce reform in this period because for a big chunk of this period, we were at war with France and patriotism ruled protest. Even people that were radical, such as Hunt, Cobbett and Wooler, lost influence and were classed as Jacobites. So that was something that people did not want to be classed as, because it was seen as terrorist-style individuals that were linked to the French Revolution. So in this time, people who were the reforming figureheads lost influence because we were at war with France. But the third bullet point here is introducing some argument into this. This argument can be questioned, because during this whole time period, if you look at the question goes up to 1820. And we know that in the years 1850 to 1820, there were a range of protests. So can you really say that there was a lack of reform because protest wasn't happening? For a big bit of the time period, yes. However, up until 1820, you must consider those 5 years, 1815 to 1820. There were a range of protests. You had the March of the Blanketeers in 1817, and you had Peterloo in 1819. You also had the Sparfield riots in 1816. These were a threat to the government's power, as they were questioning the elitist ruling classes, and people were becoming agitated, especially because after the war with France, the economy was low and people were genuinely unhappy, and there were a lot of demobilised soldiers. So it does give more strength to the argument that it was this fear of revolution that led to less reform. But it could be argued that the protests that happened in the years 1815 to 1820 may have shown that people couldn't be trusted, which led to the government being very heavy-handed and not punishing and not introducing reform. So you could say that the people sort of shot themselves in the foot. There's this argument in this course that actually the more respectful you are towards the government, the more they might listen. And the government didn't like heavy-handed approach, which led to them not listening. The next question on Chartism is perfect for this. But it must be shown that if you can do things correctly, then the government might listen. The government aren't going to introduce reform when you've got influential individuals trying to turn people on the government. So this factor, for a chunk of the question, is a good argument, but the fact it goes up to 1820, I think weakens the argument to a degree. If we go back to the question, the answer that was on the examiner report, Secondly, it would be of equal accuracy to say there was a lack of parliamentary reform because of the lack of protests that took place. That phrase there, equal accuracy, actually shows the judgment. That's what I'm talking about. This is what we need to put in our answers more. Indeed, there was an early spreading of thought by societies for calling for change, like William Cobbett, but it soon disappeared when England went to war with France until 1815. There was a low amount of protest in this period, and it will be seen as un-British to protest for something that the French had started. Therefore, during the early years, the lack of reform could be explained by the lack of pressure and opposition to the government faced. Really good answer so far. There was a severe lack of protest and was only maintained by radical reformers like Cobbett and Henry Hunt, but their popularity was undermined and they were soon labelled Jacobins. Then they do the counter-argument. This is what an A to A star student will do. They will have an argument within an argument. So instead of just saying that this factor is the be-all and end-all, they actually question the factor. So they go on to say, however, this idea cannot be used to explain the reason for a lack of reform. As in 1815, demand for reform was more than ever after soldiers returned, and it led to events such as the March of the Blanqueteers in 1817, therefore intensified the idea that reform was back on the agenda and therefore undermines the argument present. It does, it's a strong answer. This got an A grade in the real thing. Shows you that actually if you have that argument, then you will be doing very well in this paper. Pages in the textbook are there. Factor 3, the government was conservative and not liberal. Hence, they weren't going to reform. So it was nothing to do with revolution. It was the fact that the government was stuck in their ways and wanted to keep to the status quo. This can be seen in events that happened before and after the war with France, okay, as the government remained repressive and unresponsive to the demands of the working and middle class. So in 1795, the Prime Minister, William Pitt, attempted to pass a reform bill that would disenfranchise 36 of the rotten boroughs, but it was dismissed by Parliament, saying they wanted to keep the status quo of power by ensuring all power was held by the elite. So it wasn't because of revolution. This is suggesting it was because the government didn't want to lose their power. And by disenfranchising rotten boroughs, the government would have lost their power because rotten boroughs were an easy win. They were an easy thing for the government to pay for, the MPs to pay for. And the rotten boroughs and the pocket boroughs allowed for total control. Hence, there was no reform in the years 1785 to 1820 because the government was self-absorbed elitists. Now, you also had people that created texts that made the government think that they were doing right. So people like Edmund Burke, he made politicians consider that changing things may cause radical actions. So with his work, he said that if the government were to give people power, the people would respond by turning on them. The government genuinely believed that the system they had was working. And Burke said that the French Revolution occurred because of change. So the government stayed conservative to prevent issues occurring. So that's another reason why reform didn't occur. And then the government also showed they were very conservative in their actions against the people and protests, which suggested they weren't going to give up their status easily. It's seen by the Cato Street Conspiracy in 1820, which led to the execution of all the people involved within the conspiracies, including the leader Arthur Thistlewood. It is true to say that their non-liberal thinking is down to fearing revolution. So again, it links back to the factor a little bit. The fact that the government was scared of revolution made them more conservative and anti-liberal. And that was seen by the Treason Act of 1795. But it must be understood that the government was scared of losing their status. So this is an argument of both factors. Are the government more scared of reform because of the revolution, or are they more scared to do reform because they're scared of losing their place in society? Personally, I think it's the latter. I think that the government were very conservative, they were stuck in their ways, and that's why they weren't reforming. They weren't changing with the change that Britain were going through, the Industrial Revolution at this time. So the fact they weren't changing shows that, in turn, this is probably a bigger factor than the other two we've looked at. Then the last factor, the working class were not seen as respectable in the eyes of Parliament. So the government didn't reform Parliament because the working class were not on the same level as them. This was the idea that was held mostly in Parliament, as they rejected bills to propose reform on numerous occasions. What symbolises the government's response against the working class is after the Peterloo Massacre, when the 6 Acts were introduced. This banned meetings and seditious writing, and this highlights the idea that the working class were not ready for reform as the government acted harshly on them. The government would have also seen the working class as belittling their job, especially by allowing working class individuals into their hub. It would destroy the status quo of the aristocracy, and the government believed that status quo was theirs, that they deserved. That's all you need for this question. And if we go back to the essay, it's not the longest essay in the world. If you have a look at this, the government was not very liberal. It can be seen by events that happened before and after the war with France. Talked about William Pitt trying to disenfranchise rotten boroughs. Then that small paragraph there on the working and middle class not being seen as respectable enough. Obviously, that changed as the middle class developed. Then you've got a conclusion. Now, when I was looking at this, I thought it was a good conclusion, just about. In conclusion, it is somewhat accurate to say. Somewhat accurate is a really nice phrase. But the continued lack of reform is best explained by the fear of revolution, as there is evidence to support it with the events of the French Revolution, criticising the British model. That's their judgment and their explain, their J&E. On the other hand, however, on the other hand, it's not wholly accurate, as the fear of revolution went down during the Napoleonic Wars. Moreover, the underpinning ideology of many in government that reform simply wasn't worth it and the status quo should be kept is possibly the biggest argument. That bit there, like that. I mean, they don't do a nevertheless, so that's where I think this conclusion struggles a little bit and goes back to the main question, but it's a solid conclusion. So to summarise this question, was it fear of revolution? I can't believe I'm saying this. Yes and no. The government would have been scared of something similar happening to them in the French Revolution. So they would do everything they could to keep things the same. Burke supported this. The government would have understood that giving power to the people who were not aristocracy could have damaged the country. But although the government was stuck in their ways, they wouldn't give up their rights, and they believed that it was earned autonomy that gave them the right to rule, and reforming it could have changed things for the worst. So, yes, there was a fear of revolution. However, there were other factors that meant the government didn't reform in this time period. And that's the first aspect of question 1. We've got a good argument there. We've got a good solid outline. This is what the exam boards say that you should include, and we've included most of it. To be honest, at times, I would quite like to go down the route, because at the end of the day, if you get a question on this, why did the government not reform? You've now got a big chunk of factors there to help you. Now, the second question, I would argue, is probably the easier question of the two. How accurate is it to say that in the years 1838 to 48, the Chartists failed to achieve their charter because its demands were too ambitious? So basically, the charter was the 6 rules that they wanted to get across. Did they fail because at the time they were too ambitious? So basically the question is, they failed because they were too ambitious. So your first section will be yes, they were. Then you're going to try look at 2 or 3 other factors about why they weren't, and it was other reasons for failure, and then look at conclusion. Okay. So this is what the exam board say. So yes, they were too ambitious. The demand to enfranchise all men over the age of 21 might hand political power to the working class, which was unacceptable to industrialists and landholders. And before I go through the rest of this, what needs to be understood, especially in this question, that by 1832, the government had done some form of reform with the Great Reform Act. This gave more voting power to the middle classes. So Chartism was a response to the lack of vote given to the working classes. Okay. The demand for equal constituencies was a threat to the landed gentry, as the number of urban constituencies would increase at their expense. The removal of property qualification for MPs threatened the monopoly of political power, and the demand for annual elections would, in the mind of the elite, disrupt government and give too much say with those with insufficient education. Now, I'm going to go through this because that's all well and good. But once again, I've got a top-level answer for you to look at. I'm going to go through the factors and then I'm going to show you the answer, because the good thing for this is that there is only 3 factors to look at overall. Now, the one that I saw on the exam board website didn't have an introduction, which I thought was very interesting. So I've written an introduction to this, and this would be a really strong introduction, I hope. So the Chartists were formed as a direct result of the 1832 Reform Act. Their aims were outlined in the People's Charter of 1838, which outlines a range of demands that they aim to achieve, including male suffrage and payments for MPs. Many arguments suggest that at the time, the Chartists failed as they were too ambitious in a time in which conservative nature was rife, which is a key argument. It must also be considered that they failed to achieve their aims due to the movement having a lack of direction, the actions of the Chartists themselves, and the role of the government. Overall, it must be considered that following the 1832 Reform Act, the Chartists were a group which came too soon in the time frame, therefore supporting the argument that their ideas were ambitious at the time. Good introduction, gives that judgment, that criteria, and it gives a little overall. So factor 1, yes, the Chartists were too ambitious. Now I would go down this route, but again, I think at A level it's really hard to come to one factor. I think they do intertwine, and this allows you to have more argument throughout. So the aims of the Chartists were found in 1835. Okay, they were founded, the Chartists actually were created in 1835, and they were published in their manifesto, the People's Charter, in 1838. They were too ambitious and even radical for a very conservative society. Whilst they still retained elements of conservatism themselves, by not wanting to extend suffrage to women. So you can say that the Chartists were conservative because they only aimed for universal manhood suffrage. The general feeling within society that the concept of universal manhood suffrage, the removal of property qualifications for MPs, and payment for MPs didn't align with the feeling of society. The Chartists were up against a very difficult group to win over. An elitist government who had won over middle class individuals because they'd extended the franchise qualification in 1832. So their demands were very ambitious for a time in which Britain wasn't changing that much. The overall demands of the Chartists weren't actually reached until a lot later, with one of them not being reached at all. This shows that they were ambitious, and even though their ideas were good, even though their ideas were very reforming, they were very revolutionary, they were very influential, the Chartists were not actually going to be successful because of their actions. What they wanted, 5 of the 6 of the Charter was passed later on. So it shows that their demands were just too soon for the time. Chartism, the third bullet point here, was a reaction to the 1832 Reform Act, as they felt that the provisions that the government passed in the 1832 Reform Act just weren't enough to appease the whole population. The amount of people that could vote went from 11% to 18%. So this only really included the middle class. So there were a big group of people that found it insulting. This demonstrates that the conservative nature of Britain and the Chartist aims were too ambitious. If the government were only going to increase the vote by 7%, what made the Chartists think that the government were ever going to pass their charter asking for every male over the age of 21 to have a vote? You know, this was not something that the government were going to pass just like that. On top of this, there was also revolution, a fear of revolution still. So the government were not going to pass something that was so ambitious when their own position was still very on a knife edge. Further, the idea of equal representation and seat distribution were additionally too ambitious. So what the Chartists wanted was for equal representation for all, but also distribution of seats to be fairer based on the growth of the country. But the 32 Reform Act only redistributed 56 seats, which favoured areas which the government could control. So again, the Chartists were asking for too much too soon when the government were only making small, minor changes to their parliamentary franchise. Is this a key factor? Absolutely. You could say that the Chartists were far too ambitious, and this is a key factor for their lack of achievement. The 1832 Reform Act had been passed, so was the government going to be in a position to pass anything else between the years of 1838 to 1848? No. They were too conservative. The Chartists were not going to break this conservative hold that the government had on society. They were far too ambitious. They were far too serious too soon after the reforming 32 Act. So that's the first factor. And if you want to see that in actual written terms, we'll have a look at the essay. This is the fact. This is what the first factor. This was again an exam board example. It got a level 5. The aims of the Chartists were published in their manifesto, while still retained elements of conservatism themselves. The aims of universal manhood suffrage, the removal of property qualifications, did not align with the general feeling of society. Chartism was a reaction to the 32 Reform Act, and it felt provisions were not enough, with only 18% of the male population was seen as insulting. This is a really strong paragraph. It just tells you how the Chartists didn't fit into a societal trend. Another reason why the Chartists failed to achieve the aims of their charter was because they were significantly divided themselves. Chartism is split up into two ideas: physical Chartism, moral Chartism. It was always, the big thing with Chartism is it was always based around the concept of hunger politics. When the economy was bad, the Chartists popped up. So the divisions turned out to be quite significant on the grand scheme of things. So the Chartists were set up in 1835 and they held their first national convention in 1839, and this national convention showed the divisions between the Chartists. You had some individuals, such as Lovett and Atwood, who wanted to use peaceful methods such as pamphlets and petitions because they thought peaceful equals respect and the government would listen. This was because this was moral force. And they thought that because a lot of the voters had now become middle class, they would listen if they were actually respectful. So they went for the group that they thought would be on their side. A lot of the middle class people owned factories and they would be on the side of the working class, is what they thought. But the middle class also changed quite dramatically after they were given more responsibility within government. But on the other side, you had people such as Fergus O'Connor, you had O'Brien and Harney. They didn't want to go down the respectful route. These were known as physical force Chartists, and they thought that strike and armed revolution would cause change if the government didn't listen. These were very mixed attitudes, which meant that the government were actually not that scared of them because they weren't coherent enough to be able to be a threat. The government showed how confident they were against the Chartists after the first petition was presented to Parliament. In 1839, it had 1.2 million signatures, which was quite a significant petition for the time. 235 MPs rejected it, with only around 47 agreeing to it. So it shows that the government were not fearful of the Chartists because they were so disjointed in themselves. Physical force was a big problem as well because that turned the government against the Chartists. One example was the Sacred Month, which led to the government becoming harsher on the Chartists. Now, the Sacred Month was all about going on strike and using more physical force. And one example was the Newport Rising. which led to 5,000 miners clashing with troops and 500 being put in prison. This was not going to help the Chartists achieve their aim because the government were putting down revolution and they were not going to converse with people who were attacking them. By the time you get to the Kennington Common Rally, which was the signing of the third petition, a lot of the more strict Chartists, such as O'Connor, began to look at new ventures, so actually were moving away from the Chartist movement. He set up the Land Plan in 1845, which was designed to give working class families their own land and live away from urban life. This showed that Chartism could not achieve their aims as there were people looking for other solutions to their problems. So I think that is a big factor. The fact that the Chartists couldn't really organise themselves suggests that the Chartists were never going to be able to be a real threat to the status quo of society. The last factor is the government response to the Chartists. What needs to be understood is that the government also responded quite harshly, but the government also did some very clever things to be able to change the mindset of the working class. So the actions of the government must be seen as important. Now, it's not necessarily that the government shot down the Chartists. The government, instead of responding to the Chartist demands, actually made life better for the working class in some places, which meant there was less demand for change. So the government improved living and working conditions. So in 1844, they passed the 10-Hour Act, which improved working conditions. It reduced the working hours to 10 days, 10 hours. 10 days definitely would be too long. Now, this improved the working conditions for a lot of the Chartist members. So as a result, the Chartist members that were kicking off actually stopped being angry because the government did something for them. Also in 1846, the government repealed the Corn Laws, which meant that bread prices decreased, and so much of the membership had nothing to argue about. It led to less anger and led to membership numbers declining. So the government passed laws that appeased aspects of working class life. You also had the government being very determined to fight back against the Chartists. So in 1848, with the Kennington Common Rally, the government had 8,000 soldiers and 15,000 special constables, which shows that the government were very determined to destroy any sign of revolution. In rejecting the third petition, remember there were 5 million fake signatures on this petition, and after that, Chartism was effectively over. The government's actions, both angry and appeasing, can be seen as one of the main reasons for the failure to achieve the Charter, as they undermined the cause through the improvements, reducing support, as well as showing strong determination to fracture the Chartist movement. However, you must be careful. This is that double-sided argument. The fact that the government were improving the lives of the working class actually suggests that the Chartists achieved something, but not the aims of their Charter. So, did the Chartists totally fail? No. Did they fail to achieve their Charter? Yes. Yes and no. Because 5 out of the 6 things were on there eventually. So this is a much broader question and something that can have a much better argument. Okay? As I say, it's a much easier question. Now, for the next video, I'm going to go through section B of 2017, questions 3 and 4. But I'll let you have a bit of time to digest this, and if you've got any questions, just let me know.